I would like to speak about getting to know the strange other. And as Roman already said, it's about taking lessons, learning from the international dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Pentecostal churches. And I must say very honestly, and that is just to not to have any false expectations or so. I've been following the situation in Ukraine from close as I could. 5 months ago, I would never have thought that I would learn so much about Ukrainian geography. I know the main cities now in Ukraine, about Russian aggression, sadly enough, and about Western weapons. I have no idea what HIMARS is, and now I've become a fan of it in one way or another. So this is something that is in the back of my head, and I'm trying to live with you and pray with you, and in a way see your suffering and yeah, be there for you as we can. But I have to say very clearly, I'm not an expert on Ukraine at all. I'm not an expert on war. I'm not an expert on the theology of peace or anything related with that. So what I'm going to say does not, I think, necessarily directly affect the situation in which you are now, and which is actually the context in which this conference takes place. But at the same time, I do expect that for inter-church life now, for local church life, also for dealing with new people that you may meet on a daily basis, people who are had to flee their homes and who end up in your close environments, etc. I can imagine that you are actually constantly trying to get to know the strange other, and sometimes that is a very difficult process. And in that regard, I can imagine that some of the things that I want to talk about now, which come from the International Catholic-Pentecostal Dialogue, in that regard may also resonate with your current experiences and maybe useful in the future as you are thinking about the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. So having said that as an introduction, the context that I want to speak about here is the dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Pentecostal churches. And I don't know if you have ever heard about it, but it is a dialogue that has existed since 1972 already. And I will give a short introduction on this dialogue, and then I will explain to you why I think there is in ecumenical conversation something what we can call the ecumenical jukebox. There are certain, actually, I would say ecumenism and the ecumenical conversation and the strive for churches to get to know one another and to come closer to each other is a kind of a dance. Yeah, it's a dance between individuals, it's a dance between churches and communities, and they are on the one hand trying to come closer to each other, but also to take the necessary distance, and there is a constant interaction between them. This is the image that I want to use, and I think it is important to realize that in this dance, evangelicals have not been very actively involved yet. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the first part of my my talk. Then I'd like to talk with you about this dialogue, the dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Pentecostal churches, as an ecumenical laboratory in which experiments are actually taking place about how you can dialogue with someone who is spiritually, structurally, historically quite different from you. And then third, I want to speak about what we can gain from this dialogue, what the ecumenical movement can gain from dialogue with Pentecostals, by speaking about new beats and new moves that are introduced to this dance. And then I will come to some conclusions. Let me say beforehand, for clarity's sake, I am not a Pentecostal myself, and I am not a Catholic either. Why did I become involved in this research on the Catholic-Pentecostal dialogue? Because as an evangelical in Belgium, evangelicalism is a small minority, I think, as it is in Ukraine. Maybe 1.5 to 2% of the population would self-identify as evangelical. And in Belgium, evangelicals have quite a lot of difficulty to relate to one another often, but definitely to relate to the majority church, which in Belgium is the Catholic Church. And as I was learning about ecumenism and the strive for Christian unity, I realized that it is very difficult to see how evangelicals are involved and to learn about that and learn from that. But then I discovered this official dialogue between the Catholic Church and Pentecostal churches, which existed since 1972. And of course, there were many similarities between evangelicals and Pentecostals. In some ways, I would say Pentecostals are kind of a subcategory of evangelicals because they have a specific spirituality, but they share many elements with evangelicals in their spirituality and also in their way of being church, and especially in the fact that evangelicals and Pentecostals are more a movement than a organized, structured, hierarchical church, right? And in this regard, evangelicals and Pentecostals are very different from Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, and many Lutheran and or Reformed churches, right? It is more a movement. And I was wondering, how can such a movement be involved in dialogue with other traditions? How do we do that? We also need this, and we have something to offer to other churches, but how can a dialogue, a fruitful dialogue, be organized? And this is what I have learned from this Catholic Pentecostal dialogue. And that's the reason why I want to focus on it during this, this time together, okay? The ecumenical jukebox. The modern ecumenical movement started, often is said, around 1910 with the World Missionary Conference. And this was a conference in which churches from a variety of backgrounds, but very, very many of them, the large majority of them were Protestants, came together because they realized that when you are doing mission, and they were speaking about, it was very Eurocentric at the time, of course, it was mission from Europe to Africa, Eastern Asia, South America, etc. They said, if we are doing mission, we so often get into arguments with one another, and we are stealing each other's sheep, and we're not cooperating in a good way. So we should learn to cooperate better as Christians in view of Christian mission. And this movement started then, and in the beginning, the focus was on practical cooperation. And they would say, yeah, we don't need to talk about theology too much. We need to think about how we can cooperate in view of the mission of the church, in view of evangelism. But it became clear quite fast that just action together is not possible without also theological conversation. And it is out of this realization that the modern ecumenical movement came to be established. Other ecclesial groups, churches joined this conversation, Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, etc. And it was realized that there are so many differences that we need to come to a communication. And the basis, actually, and the biblical basis for this conversation is often found in John chapter 17. As we call in Dutch, the high priestly prayer of Jesus. I don't know if that's a correct English translation, but it is the prayer of Jesus in which he prays to the Father that his disciples may be one. Christ prayed for the unity of his church, and this also gives us a mandate and a responsibility to work towards this unity, because it is what Christ wants. And he does not just say, be one because we are one, but he also says, be one so that the world may believe. So the unity of the church is an essential condition for successful evangelization, for successful mission of the church. If we are one, that will be a strong testimony to the world. And we are not. As Christians, we are not one. And we have very much difficulty to recognize one another as Christians. And this is a challenge that the ecumenical movement tried to deal with in the beginning of, or starting from the beginning of the 20th century. But during this time of conversation, and when the first meetings took place, etc., in movements which came to be known, for example, as the World Council of Churches, the ones that were sitting at the dialogue table were, of course, the ones that were deciding what is important, right? They were deciding what are the essentials of ecumenical dialogue. And that meant, for example, that they said, yeah, we have certain aims that we are aiming at as we are entering the dialogue. And they would speak about full communion as an aim, or they would speak about organic unity. As churches, we need to be one organic unity, or they spoke about reconciled diversity There were different aims that they established, and these aims needed to be reached by discussions over certain key themes. And in short, the key themes that were brought to the table were discussion on baptism, discussion on Eucharist, and discussion on ministry. These were the main topics that were discussed in the ecumenical movement in the 20th century, actually. And that is a very obvious thing that this happens, right? That these questions become central, but these are not necessarily the questions that are also important for other ecclesial communities, right? And this is something that we have seen also in dialogue with evangelicals and Pentecostals, for example, when they dialogue with the Catholic Church. This is the context in which I'm familiar. I remember very well, I was at an ecumenical conference and I was speaking with an important Catholic ecumenical theologian. He was kind to me, but he didn't know much about me. And I told him that I was an evangelical. And at a certain moment, I saw him reacting and he became very defensive. And I asked him, I'm just wondering, I said, but please, can you tell me why evangelicals in Belgium are not participating in dialogues? I mean, it's not that we don't want to, but we are not invited. Why is that so? And he said, of course you're not invited because you don't even accept our baptism. And the acceptance of baptism is for him, was for him, and still is for him, the fundamental starting point of ecumenical conversation. If you don't accept our baptism, then you don't believe that I am a Christian. That is his theological starting point as a Catholic. I think it is very similar to what many Orthodox theologians would say. From an evangelical perspective, that is quite different. We do not focus on baptism as a starting point for conversation. We don't focus on baptism as a starting point for being a Christian, but we focus on conversion. If I have had a personal conversion, if I have an experience of conversion to Jesus Christ and I choose to follow him, then I am a Christian. And then I can be, and then I am already immediately in dialogue and in the kind of unity with all other believers, right? So this key theme of baptism is so essential in classical ecumenical dialogues, but for evangelicals, and the same for Pentecostals, it's not so important. Same with difficult conversations about Eucharist and also about ministry, right? In the Catholic Church and also in the Orthodox Church, there is a very strong focus on the ministry of the bishop, and the bishop who has authority over the churches and who has spiritual authority, who stands in the tradition of bishops, etc. And this is something that in most evangelical and Pentecostal communities barely exists, right? So the key themes of the ecumenical dialogues were not the themes that were of primary interest to evangelicals and to Pentecostals. And also the methods that they were using were not always easy to understand for evangelicals. For example, one of the methods that they would work with was what they called the healing of memories. Yeah? We have memories of separation, and we need to go back into history actually to see at what time this separation took place and what we can do about that, right? This works, for example, in a Lutheran Catholic dialogue, which separated in the 16th century. This may work in a Catholic Orthodox dialogue, right? Because of the separation in the 11th century. But this doesn't easily work between Pentecostals and Catholics, because they do not have a certain moment at which they separated from one another, right? So the ecumenical method, the ways in which the dialogues were taking place, also did not fit easily with the Pentecostal participants. So you could say in a way that there was a dance taking place between some ecumenical partners, Catholics, Orthodox, Reformed, Lutherans, and they were moving towards each other, moving away from each other, trying to understand each other. But the music that was chosen, the beats that were there, the dance moves that they had learned over the years were not familiar to Pentecostals and evangelicals. They did not feel comfortable with that, and they didn't know well how to deal with that. And I think this has been a primary challenge actually for getting evangelicals and Pentecostals into dialogue. So this is the reason why I started doing research on Pentecostal involvement in the dialogue, which did exist. and existed actually since 1972. Let me give you a short introduction to this dialogue itself. And I would say it has functioned as an ecumenical lab because very new methods, new things have been developed there. Let me first ask, is the speaking speed okay and things like that, or should I slow down or speed up? Do you hear me, überhaupt?
Yeah, we have, Ksenia, do you have any comment?
I think it's okay, but I try to listen. Maybe translators will comment, but
okay. If there's a problem,
if there's a problem, then I will tell you. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay. The dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Pentecostal churches started in 1972. And the reason that it started in 1972 was actually kind of a mutual curiosity. The reason for the mutual curiosity between Pentecostals and Catholics was the charismatic movement. In the late 1960s, within the Catholic Church, a spiritual movement came into being, which was very much like the Pentecostal movement. They were learning from them. And the Catholic Church thought, we don't know exactly what to do with that, with these people who are trying to speak in tongues and all that. What do we do with it? And the Pentecostals were thinking, how can these people be speaking in tongues and be Pentecostal and still stay in the church and pray to Mary? Something is wrong here. So they had a mutual interest in each other. And because of actually a friendship that developed between a classical Pentecostal leader, his name was David du Plessis, he was a South African theologian, and Killian MacDonald, who was a Catholic priest, slowly but surely an official dialogue was initiated. And it started in the first phase, 1972 to 1976, with kind of mutual introduction. They wanted to get to know each other. And this dialogue in the first phase was actually a dialogue between official representatives from the Catholic Church and some classical Pentecostal leaders. The Catholic Church would appoint theologians to participate in these dialogue sessions. And they were renowned professors of theology. They had big degrees and they had studied theology for 15 years. And on the other side of the table were the Pentecostals, and they were very charismatic leaders with often no theological training or very limited theological training. And they tried to find ways in which they could understand each other and could learn from one another. So in this first phase, they spoke about very different topics, about Pentecostalism mostly and about spirituality. And to facilitate the conversation, they even invited some Protestants, some charismatic Protestants. And they would say, yeah, maybe they can serve as kind of an in-between if we don't understand each other. So they were really struggling with, how do we do this? How do we do this dialogue? In the second phase, which started in 1977 to 1982, this was actually a phase in which there was very strong confrontation between these groups. They tried to speak about very controversial topics for them, speaking in tongues, about healing, about the topic of tradition and traditions, and about Mary and Mariology. And the Pentecostal team was also struggling with a lot of resistance within their own constituency. These Pentecostal leaders that were sitting at the table got a lot of criticism from their own people, actually. And I will tell you more about that a bit later. In the third phase, 1986 to 1990, this was the first phase in which they really worked with one overarching theme. And it was a theme of koinonia, communion, a theme that was very fertile at that time in the ecumenical movement broadly. And they thought that they could learn from one another in this topic. And a very important shift took place in the Pentecostal dialogue team during this phase. In the earlier phases, the Pentecostals would invite as many influential leaders as they could. So people would come for one time, and they would come for 2 times, and then they wouldn't come anymore, and later they would return, and sometimes there would be 10 people, sometimes there would be 15, sometimes there would be 5. They just tried to gather everyone who was interested to come. During the third phase, they shifted and said, no, what we need to do is have representation of good quality Pentecostal theologians. They need to represent us. They need to speak not for the churches. They don't have the authority maybe that some of the Pentecostal bishops or denominational leaders have, but they can speak from the organizations, because it's impossible in any ways that they would make certain agreements with Catholics that everybody should follow or so. This is not how the Pentecostal movement is organized. And this is actually the time at which some of the bigger names at that time in the Pentecostal movement started to be involved in the dialogue. And one of them was one of the speakers earlier on Monday, Miroslav Volf. He was one of, at that time, Pentecostal theologians who was involved in this dialogue. Then in phase 4, starting in 1990, they spoke about evangelization, proselytism, and common witness, because they said, we have been talking about koinonia, about unity and community. And we do agree that there is some kind of union between us. It's very difficult to say in what way, but there is something that binds us because we all try to follow Jesus Christ. But why then would Pentecostals steal sheep from the Catholic Church? And why would Catholics be very critical towards the work, evangelization work of Pentecostals? So they focus on phase 4 on proselytism and on this question of how do Christians deal with one another, and can we work together in evangelization, or do we need to keep distance from each other and criticize each other? And this report that was published in 1997 is to date still the best report on this topic, in my personal opinion. Now, from these topics of koinonia and proselytism, they realized that the underlying difficulty is the one that I already mentioned in my earlier dialogue with this Catholic theologian. The big question and the big topic that differentiates Pentecostals and Catholics, and I think it also goes for evangelicals and Catholics and Orthodox, is on becoming a Christian. When do you become a Christian? Is this when I have a personal conversion to Jesus Christ, or is this when I'm taken up in the church through baptism, and how can they be combined, etc.? And this is the topic that they dealt with, and it took a long time to go through it in the 5th phase on becoming a Christian. And this is also, by the way, the last topic that I focus on in my research, because I was working on my dissertation at that time. But thereafter, they had a 6th phase, which focused also on charisms in the life of the church. And currently, they're still talking on lex orandi, lex credenda, about the law of prayer, the law of believing. What you believe is also what you spiritually pray, and the other way around. Yeah, and how this connected to liturgy as well. So these are the topics that they have been dealing with in the last, that's now 40 years, no, 50 years. So this is a dialogue in which evangelicals, Pentecostals have been involved for 50 years already, meeting annually with Catholics in this case. The participation of Pentecostals in this dialogue caused some serious challenges, but also gave new opportunities. And I want to give some examples of that. One thing is what I already mentioned, theological themes, right? I would say classical Pentecostalism can be defined by 3 terms. It is a conversionist movement, focusing on conversion as a starting point for Christian life. Yeah? It is a revivalist movement, focusing on the fact that the Holy Spirit is constantly giving a revival of his work in the church. And in Pentecostal perspective, and many evangelicals would agree with that, we need to try to follow these revivals, right? We need to take part of that and see how also in our context revival can take place. And third, classical Pentecostalism is a restorationist movement, which means that they focus in their theology on restoring the theology and also the life of the early church. And this contrasts, of course, a lot with a Catholic theology, which focuses on tradition, building on tradition. You see, restoration means you're constantly going back to the starting point of the 1st and 2nd century church. And these theological themes which identify classical Pentecostalism are, of course, the themes that they also wanted to talk about. And therefore, they wanted to focus on conversion and conversion experiences. These were topics that were very important for Pentecostals, and topics for which the Catholics were much more critical. Yeah? And I'm pointing now to the details, but I will not speak about it. In the different final reports that were written, slowly but surely, the focus came more and more on this topic of conversion. And it is really this 5th phase in which a whole theme has been, and a whole phase has been used to speak about what does it mean to become a Christian. And then the question that is related to that is, what is conversion? And what is the role of my personal conviction in that? What is the role of the Holy Spirit in that? What is the role of the church in that? What is the role of baptism in that? How do we deal with this question? How do I become a Christian, and how do I grow from the starting point into being a mature Christian? This was the topic of their phase. So with the arrival of Pentecostals in the ecumenical movement, new theological themes came up that needed to be discussed, and conversion was one of them that was very, very central. Other examples of topics that came up there, but that would be very typical for Pentecostalism, and which are not very present in theological ecumenical dialogue today, would be charismatic experiences, would be the place of spirit baptism, would be questions about the second coming of Christ and eschatology. And these are topics which are very important in Pentecostal and evangelical spirituality. And these are topics that, so to say, we have to offer to other churches to think about as well, and that they can learn about the theologies that we have been developing about that, and how it influences not only our church life, but also our individual personal spirituality. So these are kinds of new themes that can be brought to the dialogue table by evangelicals, by Pentecostals. A second new element in the Catholic Pentecostal dialogue is the dialogue method, the way in which they had this conversation. And let me go back to what I said earlier, and it starts already in the very first time that they met. These dialogue teams were so different. On the one hand, there were classical Pentecostal leaders, very charismatic, a lot of local authority, very zealous for the and filled with the Holy Spirit. And on the other hand, were very serious Catholic theologians, highly educated, but they did not speak the same language. They did not speak on the same theological level. They did not have the same interests. So they needed to find ways in which they could dialogue with one another. And an extra element that made this more important is the fact that the classical Pentecostal constituency, so the churches and the denominations were very critical towards this dialogue. Many were saying, how is it possible that as a Pentecostal, you go to Rome and you sit at the table with these bishops and with these theologians who, for example, in South America, are crushing us on TV and in politics and in society, and they are persecuting us. And you as Pentecostals go to Rome and you visit the Pope, because they would have visits with the Pope from time to time. How can you do that? Are you not supposed to defend us against these Catholics instead of sharing the table with them? So there was this very critical attitude. And of course, those who were sitting at the table were also very suspicious of one another. Although there was somewhere this desire to enter into dialogue, they were very suspicious of each other. So they needed to think about a dialogue method, a way to have these conversations that would allow them to really understand each other and to learn from each other. And maybe I can, as an example, tell a little bit about how these dialogue meetings really go before I go to the next point. I have had the privilege to participate in one of the sessions of the Catholic Pentecostal dialogue because I was working on this topic. As I said, I'm not a Catholic nor a Pentecostal, but because I was working on this, I was allowed to participate one time. And the Pentecostals would say, you're half a Pentecostal. So yeah, you can be in our team. The dialogue teams would consist of about 5 to 6 people from each side. 5 to 6 Catholic representatives, 5 to 6 Pentecostal representatives. The Catholics would think very well about who was present there. They would have a very mixed group. Someone from South America, from North America, from Europe, someone from China was there, an African, and I think one more European. Yeah. So from the different regions of the world, they would have men and women. They would have priests, nuns, theologians. They would have people who were active in the charismatic movement. They would have people who were active in certain orders. So they tried to make a mixture of people that really broadly represented the Catholic Church. They could do that quite easily. I asked, by the way, one of these African theologians who was there, I asked him, so how did you get here? He said, well, I got a phone call from my bishop, and he said, we want you to think about participating in the Catholic-Pentecostal dialogue. And he said, I know what it means. It means that I have to do it. So I said, after a week, I said, yes, I thought about it, and I'm very willing to do this, because this is how our church works. If you are given a task, you need to do what is asked. And of course, the church paid for that. For the Pentecostals, that was much more difficult. They tried to bring together the people that had some money for it and who knew a bit about theology, right? And those who had some time to come and to be present there. So sometimes this group was 8 people, sometimes there were only 3 or 4. In the time that I was there, and I think throughout the whole dialogue, more than 90% were men. A very large majority were North Americans and Europeans. Just a few people from outside of these regions were present, right? So in this regard, the groups are very different. They would come together for a week. And every day, they would start with a moment of prayer, led one day by the Catholics, the other day by the Pentecostals. And they would do it in their own way. The Catholics would take elements from their liturgy. The Pentecostals would make it an open moment of conversation and prayer with each other, right? It would be very important that they eat together. Every time they were expected to eat together. And then you can talk about whatever you want, but you're not allowed to miss these meals. I heard about one session in which one of the bishops said, no, I'm more like a solitary person, I want to eat alone. That was not accepted. They had to be part of this conversation. And in this way, they tried to bring, of course, and this is obvious, they tried to bring interpersonal relations, growing interpersonal relations. And then they would have different sessions. And now I'm coming closer to the point that I want to make with this part. The week would open with a paper on a certain topic from Pentecostal side and a paper on the same topic from Catholic side. Both would have a paper of about an hour. The topic when I was there was healing. After this paper, there was time for questions of understanding. Do we understand each other? A little bit of conversation. And thereafter, and now it comes a particular element of this dialogue, they would go separate in caucuses. The Pentecostals would be together and the Catholics would be together. And they would write what they called hard questions for the other. And let me focus on this for a moment. Hard questions was a method that was established in this dialogue. And what does it mean? Here is the definition as it was being given by Killian MacDonald, one of the early Catholic participants, the first chairman. He said, a hard question is a question which pushes hard, even too hard, on what the questioner sees as a deficiency, a weakness, a misreading of the scriptures, a failure in theological method, attributing exaggerated importance to a given emphasis. Hard questions do not attempt to be fair. In another definition, he said, hard questions are actually impolite questions. You just ask the question that you want to ask in the way you want to ask them. No theological kindness, blah, blah, blah. If the Catholics wanted to know something about prayers, they would just ask the question very directly. Pentecostals would ask, for example, why do you pray to Mary? You know, very simple questions, very direct, the theological problems that they saw. And this worked very well because, and here is my point in this, because the context was already there. So they were separated in caucus, they would formulate 2 or 3 hard questions, and then they would come together again and discuss them. Each group would ask their questions, and then, if the questions were well understood, they would go separate again, and each group would formulate answers to the questions. Yeah? So these hard questions were just put on the table, and answers were being formulated separately, and thereafter they would come together again and try to see where do we agree and where are our differences. The use of these hard questions was, I believe, very important for these this dialogue to be successful, because first of all, these hard questions allowed each team to select the items for discussion that they found important. Yeah, each team could say, this is a topic that we need to focus on if you're talking about healing, Mary, salvation, whatever. Secondly, it brought balance in the discussions. Even if the Catholics would be in a team of highly developed academic theologians, the Pentecostals did not have to speak on this academic level, but they could just ask the simple questions that they wanted to ask. There was no problem at all. It brought balance. And third, it brought the dialogues also to the level of ecclesial praxis. The questions became immediately practical and not highly theological and abstract. And this was important, particularly for the Pentecostal dialogue team. But the reason that it worked, that this confrontational method worked, is because of the context. This is my conviction, because they are together for 5 days or 6 days, because they have breakfast together, because they try to pray together, because they even had like an outing for a day, right? So they really tried to build a context within which such difficult questions could be discussed. And I think this is an important gain of this method. Third, when we speak about, oh yeah, maybe to finish my story, how does this week end? So after these conversations, they would try to write down certain responses for each other, and they would try to come up with a summary of their conversations. And after a number of years, because they would meet for a week every year, then they would try to bring all of this information together, right? So, and it, having seen all these documents, I have seen dozens of documents, starting from the hard questions to the summaries, to new summaries, etc. It is very clear that not the theological papers with which they started were central for the theological development, but it were these hard questions. These were the ones that really pinpointed the topics that were needed to be discussed and the way in which the conversation developed. Okay, third, after dialogical method, also theological method was renewed in this dialogue. As I already said, the Classical Pentecostal movement is a restorationist movement. And that means that they always want to go back to the teaching and the practice of the early church, the 1st and the 2nd century, which is very different from Catholic theology, which always wants to build upon the latest theological developments, right? So Pentecostals are very critical towards this doctrinal development in tradition. And how did they try to deal with that? An interesting development was in phase 5, where they were speaking, as I said, about becoming a Christian. And they decided here in this dialogue to not only learn from scripture, but also to learn from the early church. Why did they do that? Because the Catholic Church would say, but there is so much that we can learn from the church of the 1st and 2nd and the 3rd century, right? That is fundamental for understanding how the church came into being and the key topics of theology, etc., and how the Christian church actually struggled in the Roman Empire. All of that is very important to understand. And for the Classical Pentecostals, this worked very well as well, because as restorationists, they would say we need to go back always to the earliest church. And that's not just the church in Acts, but also the church in the 1st centuries. So this was a method that they used, in which they, on the one hand, broke with the Catholic focus on the whole tradition, and on the other hand, broke with the Pentecostal focus on only scripture, right? They tried to broaden learning from both scripture and the early church. And this was very difficult, to be honest, because it required also the Pentecostal participants to read and integrate teaching of the church fathers. But it is something that they actually managed to do. And I think this demonstrates as well how this dialogue allows new ways of doing ecumenical dialogue to be developed. So in this Classical Pentecostal dialogue, through the participation of Pentecostals, new theological themes were developed, new dialogue method was developed, new theological methods were developed. It is possible through such dialogues to be integrated and to grow. Of course, there are also very clear weaknesses in this dialogue. And I have named a few already, but I will give you some more. One is the one that I mentioned already, the representation of the Classical Pentecostal movement. They were not fairly represented. They were mostly white, North American and Western European. They were male. and they did not take into consideration the breadth of the movement at all. This was a weakness which is very clear. Second, a very big difficulty of the Pentecostals is what we call ecumenical reception of the dialogue results. So we have this dialogue which has taken place for 50 years already between Catholics and Pentecostals, and I wonder how many of you had ever heard about it, right? It's very easy for a Catholic church to bring these things to their constituency. How do they do that? The bishops would accept certain texts. They would be integrated in textbooks. They would be integrated in education, in seminaries, etc., and that would clearly trickle down to the local churches even. But for the Pentecostal movement, it's incredibly difficult to really bring the results of this dialogue to the level of the local churches. And they tried many ways in which they would do that. They tried to write popular articles about it. They tried to integrate different leaders or invite them just to come and observe and to learn from that. They tried to install local dialogues in which some of the results would be taken up and all of that, but it was a very difficult process. And a final weakness that I would like to point to, and which I think is actually very essential, is that there is so limited attention for hermeneutical questions. The way in which Pentecostals and evangelicals read the Bible is often so different from how Catholics do that and Orthodox do that. And it is necessary to take that into consideration. So give attention not just to the starting point of the Bible, but the way in which it is being read. And this is a topic that has not yet surfaced in this dialogue. So I think there is more to be learned. I'm almost coming to my end. A fruitful dialogue, ecumenical dialogue with Pentecostal involvement, thus with the involvement of a movement, a non-institutional movement, an evangelical spirituality is possible, it is challenging, and it is also needed. It is really necessary that we are involved. Because this classical dance, as I showed it, is a dance in which the moves have already been decided, the themes have been decided, the partners have been there for a long time. But if new people are integrated into this dance, into these conversations, then it can grow and it can become very different again. And it may look a bit weird maybe, but if you really integrate new voices and new people, it may also be very enriching. I have published this, what I've been saying today, in an article entitled Dance to the Beat of Your Own Drum, which I think you have been sent to you beforehand as well. Some of you have it. And I've written more about this topic as well, but I would like to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'd like to hear if you have any further questions. The diversity of doctrines which developed is, of course, one of the main challenges of the ecumenical movement, of course, right? We need to try to understand each other and see if we can bring our differences closer together. Now, maybe two things that are important, three things to say that are important. One, and I will quote an Orthodox theologian who said, I forgot his name now, to be honest, the walls between the churches do not reach to heaven. Yeah, there are these walls between churches which divide us, but they are not eternal. And there must be a way in which we can transcend them. And it's not we who transcend them, it is Christ actually who is seeking for the unity of his church, right? So is this something that we can easily resolve? No, we cannot. But that does not mean that the conversation is useless, of course. A second point that I would like to mention is there should also be space for something that is called diversity, reconciled diversity. It is possible, and we recognize it all, I think, in our churches as well. There is diversity of opinions on many theological topics, and still we can cooperate, we can recognize one another as brothers and sisters in Christ, and we can seek to come closer together, right? So diversity in doctrine is not necessarily problematic. And then third, and this builds on the former, in Catholic theology, there is something what they call, and I like it a lot actually, They call it a hierarchy of truths. Some elements of Christian faith are more important than others. And I think this is something we all feel as well, right? And it is okay in some elements that we have diversity if we agree on some essentials. Of course, the next question is, but which are the essentials? And there is a diversity of opinions on that as well. But at least we know that there are some elements in which there is diversity possible. And a good example of how this works is actually the result of the Catholic-Lutheran dialogue. They have had a dialogue on justification, which ended in 1999 with the declaration on the doctrine of justification. And in this document, it was signed on the 31st of October, very typically. On this document, they actually say, in essence, we agree in our soteriology, in our perspective on justification. This is how we agree, and this is how we interpret some things differently. Right? That's how the document is set up. And that is, I think, very valuable to see that such a topic even can be discussed between Catholics and Lutherans, a topic on the basis of which actually the church was split from Protestant perspective. One final remark on this. It is much more difficult in this regard to dialogue with the Orthodox Church, because the Orthodox Church does not recognize a hierarchy of truths. Orthodox Church will say there is the Orthodox faith, there is the tradition with capital T, and you're in or you're out. And obviously, I'm out. And the only way to come into full unity with an Orthodox is by becoming Orthodox. And in this regard, I like very much the approaches that evangelical and Pentecostal churches bring into ecumenical dialogue, that is starting from spiritual unity. It is possible to have some spiritual unity, even if there is no structural unity, if there is no dogmatic unity, etc. Of course, how that can be is the next question. So that's some thoughts on your first question. Then on your second question, how come that, and I like the way in which you phrase it, sane Catholics and Catholics and Orthodox don't become evangelical, but evangelicals become Catholic and Orthodox? Well, I disagree with your statement, to be honest. In Belgium, at least, the whole evangelical movement exists out of former Catholics and their children. I mean, this is 80–90%, I think. I assume that the same is true for the large majority of Orthodox, of evangelicals and Baptists in Ukraine. It started with people who converted from Orthodoxy. So I don't think it has to. It is true that the conversions only take place in one direction. Second, what about the possibility of why are so many people then attracted to Orthodox and Catholic theology? I think this has to do with a weakness of theological evangelical theology. Who was it who said in his famous book called The Evangelical Mind? And he said, the problem with the evangelical mind is that there is no evangelical mind. There is not, evangelicals have often have an anti-rational presupposition. And this is very problematic. And especially those who want to think and want to broaden and want to grow theologically feel discomfortable in that context. My response to that would be dual, and then I end. And I'm sorry if I take this to you personally, Rodion, but it's a broader question, as you understand. One is, I think evangelicals exactly need these people because they broaden and they deepen the evangelical movement. So they should stay in, right? And two, the difficulty with switching traditions is that you lose all ecumenical credibility. If you switch, and the same goes for me, of course, if someone switches from Catholic to become evangelical or the other way around, you can never thereafter say, yes, but I mean, I think that actually Catholics and evangelicals or kind of equal. They were on the same level. Well, if they were on the same level, then you wouldn't have switched, right? So this is one of the reasons for me to be very careful with switching affiliation, if I may say it so simply, because thereafter it is very difficult to be credible towards the tradition that you came from, and you will be often taken up as, aha, here is another one who converted to the real church, right? And that's a position I would not easily feel comfortable with. Yes, I know of such examples, and I think they are very important. When we speak about ecumenism, we often think, and definitely when we think about this as theologians and in theological institutions, we talk about theological ecumenism. We talk about these conversations about dogma, right? While when we speak about ecumenism, it is much broader than that. Ecumenism, I would say, has to do with three levels. And answers can be different. Can we pray together? And this is inter-individual. Can we celebrate together? And this has to do with your ecclesiology. And can we act together? And this is what you also call this political dimension. What can we do with one another for the world, right? Mm-hmm. And on this regard, coming then to the question, is it possible to have an ecumenical meetings just among believers? Yes, that is absolutely possible. And this is one of the advantages of free churches, free church ecclesiology, is that you are not dependent on what your denominational leader says or does. You're not dependent on whether or not they are willing to have an official dialogue with a Catholic bishop or not. I mean, I don't know exactly, of course, how it works in Ukraine, and it will probably depend on the denomination in which you are. It's the same here in Belgium, I assume. But I had with my local church in Aarschot, we had quite some years ago now, we had a strong desire to organize what we call Bible Expo. It is actually an exposition about the Bible, which can be integrated in a museum. It's made by evangelicals in Belgium, by the Evangelical Mission in Belgium. It's about the value of the Bible for individuals, what is the Bible, etc. Right? So it's very instructive also for schools. It's also cultural and etc. And we really wanted to do this. And then we said, if we try to organize it, we can put it probably in a garage somewhere and try to send some folders and hope that 2 or 3 people will find it. Why don't we try to cooperate with the local Catholic Church? And we did. It was a very interesting experience, but we set up a cooperation between the Catholic Church, a Pentecostal church, and our own church, and together we established this Bible Expo to come to our town. And because of the involvement of the Catholics, this could be organized within the city museum. So it became part of the city museum, and I think 2,000 secondary school students came there from Catholic schools. They all were coming there to learn about the Bible, and this was a huge success. And we worked also together. So I was giving tours in this museum, but the Catholic priest was also giving tours, and the Pentecostals were giving tours, and different members of our church was giving tours, etc. And this is a way in which we together try to do something good for town, for our city, giving space to the Bible and giving attention to the Bible. Now that's one. So that is on the local level, but the next level would of course be individuals, right? One element which two things I'd like to say. One is, as an individual, we of course have freedom to visit other people's church services. And this is something that is a very good starting point, I would say. If you visit the local Orthodox parish or Catholic parish or whatever, once or twice, they will not ask any questions probably, and they will leave you alone. And thereafter, you will start talking with people, right? And automatically the question will come, who are you? What do you believe, etc. The next question then is, of course, but how then to do this dialogue, how to talk with people from such another theological background? And there is a very interesting initiative which was established in 1999. It's called the Global Christian Forum, and it has nowadays also local initiatives in different countries and regions. And their initiative is the following. They don't try to bring together theologians who talk about theological issues, but they bring people together from different backgrounds, and they all answer the very simple question: who is Jesus Christ for you? The first time that this was organized was done with half classical ecumenical participants, Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Anglican, etc., and half were evangelicals and Pentecostals. And they were brought together in one room, about 60 participants. And the chair of this meeting, his name was, looking for his name now. He was also the chair of the Catholic-Pentecostal dialogue. Okay, whatever, it'll come. No, not David, no, okay. The chair of this meeting said, okay, I'm going to ask you who Jesus is for you. And it was very clear that these classical ecumenical churches, Catholic, Orthodox, etc., they didn't really know what to do with this question. And then he said, let me first ask this Pentecostal person here. And this Pentecostal person says, well, Jesus Christ is for me my personal savior. And he told his conversion story. He said why he had become a Christian and what it meant to him. And after he had given his testimony, which we all know how to do it, giving a testimony, we have learned to do that. One of the Orthodox monks stood up and he said, I can tell a story like that as well. It's actually the story how I was called by Christ to go into the monastery. And he told of his personal spiritual journey as an Orthodox believer to become a monk. And then these moments of recognition came and they said, oh, yeah, there are some things that are similar. I mean, we don't have monks as evangelicals, but we do recognize the spiritual journey and the challenges that you're speaking about, etc. And the idea was that they would do a round in an hour, you know, everybody would speak for 1 minute, 60 people. But this introduction lasted 3 days. And then they said, maybe we have found a new method of ecumenical dialogue. And this is one in which evangelicals and Pentecostals feel very much at home. And I think it is one that may also work for you and me when we meet individual believers in our context who call themselves Christians, but who are strange to us. I think, yes, in a way that is possible. It is possible to come closer to one another again, to the Catholic Church, to the Orthodox Church, to other Protestant churches, of course. But for me, the main thing that differentiates Protestants, and it has to do with this mutation, but what differentiates Protestants from Orthodox and Catholics in the first place is the fact that and definitely this goes for evangelical free churches, is that we do not have a theological difficulty to recognize a Catholic to be a Christian or a Catholic community to be a Christian community if they are a communion of believers, right? There is not a and this is also why Protestantism splits so easily into different denominations, because there are separations, but they can separate for, so to say, minor theological issues, or sometimes even for practical reasons, but they don't stop recognizing one another as Christians and as Church of Christ usually, right? I may disagree with something that happens in a certain Baptist or evangelical or Pentecostal church, but I will say, if they are followers of Jesus Christ, then they are Christians, right? And they are my brothers and sisters. And so this allows this quite easy mutation and differentiation of Protestantism. And this is a big difference with Orthodoxy and Catholicism, where to be within the church means to be, in Orthodox perspective, within tradition, and thus under the authority of a bishop who is standing in the historical succession. in a certain patriarchate, etc., in a certain structure, and having taken certain rituals, or baptism, and then most particularly Orthodox baptism, and participating in the Eucharist, and then only Orthodox Eucharist, right? So there were a number of preconditions to be fully recognized as a Christian. And this is very limited for Protestants, and similar things happen for the Catholic Church as well. So that goes back a bit further back than what your question exactly was. I realize that, but I think it's an important background for it. So if you ask then, is it possible to return or to mutate back closer to Catholicism? I think yes, that is definitely possible, but it will not be easy for Protestants to take up again these kinds of sacramental and hierarchical historical presuppositions. That is something that Protestants usually feel quite uncomfortable with. It is possible, though. One of the interesting stories within the Catholic-Pentecostal dialogue is that some South African Pentecostal leaders who were involved in the dialogue started to change their habits. They started to wear long robes and big crosses and purple, and they wanted to be called bishop. And the other Pentecostals were very annoyed with that, because they said, what you're doing is you're just trying to copy these Catholics. And actually the Catholics were also annoyed with it, because they said, yeah, you're playing Catholic, but you're not standing in the right tradition. You're just using our clothes and using some of our symbols. So even if that happens, you cannot really say that they are mutating closer towards Catholicism, because the Catholic Church has very clear preconditions of being within full communion. And that means standing in a tradition, being under the bishop, and in the end being under the Bishop of Rome, right? And I don't think that many Protestants would be tempted to go into that direction of accepting papal authority. Although many would say, and I am one of those, I like the current Pope, and I'm glad that he is representing Christendom to many people in society. No, I don't see lines, because what we are doing in ecumenical dialogue is talking with one another. And I think what we should always aim to do is to talk to the other, however different they are. By being in conversation is not the same as by accepting the claims of the other or the actions of the other, etc. And I do realize that in the current situation of war, this is not an easy thing to say. So let me stick to the ecumenical topic. But here, I think if you say, with whom can you talk and with whom can you not talk, I would say, well, I could talk. I should be. I think it is my duty somewhere to be able to talk with everybody who claims to be a follower of Jesus Christ, even if I may very much disagree with the fact that he calls himself a Christian. And it even goes further than that, Anatoly. I think if a Muslim would want to talk with me about faith and belief, I would also be open to that conversation. But I would not call that ecumenical dialogue. So in that regard, I do have limitations. For me, ecumenical dialogue is a dialogue between those who consider themselves to be followers of Christ, consider themselves to be Christian. And that's not the average Muslim, to my understanding. Okay, let me first say something about the Catholic Church, right? In my understanding, the Catholic Church would allows a lot of diversity within itself, as long as individuals and communities can say that they follow the Catholic tradition, Catholic teaching, and that they accept, in the end, it means that they accept the Pope as the authority of the Church, right? So in that regard, if they recognize something of God's work, then they can integrate it into their Catholic Church. This is also the reason why the Catholics will say, you know, why don't you just all come to the Catholic Church? You know, everybody is welcome with us. You just need to accept some basic elements, right? On the other hand, if you ask about Pentecostals or evangelicals being Catholic, well, and I'm not trying to be sneaky, but I would go back first to the question about what is Catholic. I don't think that they will easily become Roman in saying, accepting the authority of Rome in everything they do and say, right? And standing into the Roman tradition. But if Catholic means unity and diversity, if Catholic means being part of the Catholic, of the universal church, then I would say I am Catholic, and I'm a very convinced Catholic. But that does not mean that I am a Roman Catholic. I do believe that as an evangelical, I can be challenged by and also enriched by theology from other traditions. And this is something that I have experienced in my own life. And I think many of you as well, right? You don't believe exactly the same as what you believed 20, 25 years ago. You have developed theologically. And much of what you have learned comes from other traditions, at least in my case. And that is very okay, because I do believe that the church is more than my personal local theology and than my local congregation. So I need to be enriched actually by this Catholicity of the church, by the unity of diversity in the church. And I will have some elements with which I can fully agree and some elements with which I fully disagree within the Catholic tradition, for example. Just to give one example, in the local church in which I have been pastor, and I'm still going to this church, we now focus much more on the importance of the Lord's Supper. This has to do with growing in theological understanding for us. It has to do with the Catholic context. It also had to do, by the way, with Corona and the fact that we realized how important the celebration of the symbol of unity, which is the Lord's Supper, is, right? So we do it now on a weekly basis, while we used to do it once or twice a month. That's a theological development. If we now try to, if we look at people visiting our church in Aarschot, the questions that we ask them for participation in the Lord's Supper is, do you accept wholeheartedly the articles of the faith? And then we refer to the apostolic confession. Have you been baptized? And do you seek to follow Christ wholeheartedly? You know, so we ask about faith, we ask about a kind of a sacrament, baptism, and we ask about their personal conviction and their personal life. And if they can say yes to these three elements, they are free to participate. And if they say, but I'm a Catholic, then we would say, yes, but do you accept the 12 articles of faith? Yes. Have you been baptized? Yes. Do you try to follow Christ? Yes. Then you're welcome. Have we become more Catholic? I don't know. But we have developed, yeah. I'm thinking now, I cannot remember that the that the Pentecostal team in the classical Pentecostal dialogue has ever explicated their expectation of full unity. No. They also say that they focus in this dialogue on getting to know each other and learning to understand each other more. This has two reasons. On the one hand, because the Pentecostals cannot simply say something there in this dialogue and make certain theological statements that then the whole Pentecostal movement must follow. They don't have any authority, right? I mean, that is what the Catholics can do. If the Catholics come to a certain agreement, for example, with the Lutherans, then they can forward it, so to say, within the Catholic hierarchy. And if it is accepted, then the Pope will sign a document and they have reached some further step into doctrinal unity. But this is something that the Pentecostals cannot do. they don't have any authority over Pentecostal churches because Pentecostalism is a non-institutional movement, right? So for this reason alone already, they don't aim within this dialogue at reaching doctrinal unity. They can't, they don't have any authority to get any further. So to my knowledge, they also never say, this is what we are aiming at in the end. No, clearly not. Is it possible, is your question, that doctrinal unity is achieved? Well, then I would go back to actually my answer to the first question. I think that the acceptance of diversity, or the possibility of diversity, is very important. The question is how much diversity is possible and is good, and which are essentials on which we need to find each other, right? I don't believe that there will be a moment at which the whole Christian church will agree doctrinally on everything. No way. I mean, my church doesn't even agree with the other evangelical church 20 kilometers down the road, right? So no way that we will discuss globally between all these traditions. But I do believe that, and this isn't a typical free church perspective, an evangelical conversionist perspective, I do believe that it is possible to have a very broad understanding and respecting one another as being Christians. And that's, I know it's not the same, and then we come back to the spiritual unity indeed. But that's, I think it's a very important starting point. But yeah, doctrinal unity, I don't even know if that is an aim to be reached. Doctrinal unity is important if it makes spiritual unity impossible. But yeah, you know, I know I'm joking, of course, but I don't remember in the prayer of Jesus that he would say, "I pray that they will be all one in doctrine, and so that the world may believe all the same thing." No, it's one doctrine, unity in doctrine, is for me not an essential element that we as a church need to strive for. We need to have unity in essentials and diversity in all other matters. I pointed to eschatology as one of the topics that I believe would be important in such dialogue. But it was not very present in the dialogue that I researched, not at all. I think it is a topic that should be more important. I agree with that. And in this regard, I think, but I don't know in which Pentecostal tradition you stand or that you are thinking from, but I think at least where I grew up in the evangelical denomination in which I grew up, we had a very specific, very biblicist and very exceptionalist understanding of eschatology. Eschatology was about, and is in most of the churches, about something that's about to happen soon. It's about a terrible situation that the world is going to go through, and few will be saved from that, and it will be us. That's in short what eschatology is about. And I think that this is a perspective which demonstrates feeling of superiority. Because it starts from the presupposition, and this is related to what you just said. This starts from the presupposition that we have to be very careful with others who call themselves Christians. We must be the only ones, right? And striving for unity might be working together with the Antichrist. And over the years, I have learned to see other very different perspectives on eschatology, which put this particular perspective in perspective. And for me now, and I have learned this actually not from Catholics or from Orthodox, I've learned it from a Calvinist theologian, Oskar Kuhlmann, a Swiss theologian. For me, eschatology is about the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation. And this plan of salvation is expressed here and there, and it starts already at creation. And it is the story of God who so loved the world that he gave his only son, and who wants this world to be saved. And this perspective, which focuses on God, who throughout the whole of history has sought to deal with people, deal with sin, but always be forgiven, and always sought to restore creation to its real value. This is an eschatology which gives me much more hope, and which gives me enthusiasm to work together with other Christians towards a more peaceful world. And it does not take away the fact that these difficult times are to come as well, and that something is there which is anti-Christ, right? But it helps me to focus on the good plan that God has with his world. So this is just my personal opinion on this topic, but I think this is something that Pentecostals and evangelicals they have an eschatology to offer in ecumenical dialogue, and they have things to learn in ecumenical dialogues as well. That's actually what I want to say. Yeah. So yes, our eschatology has certain strengths, but it also has certain weaknesses, and this is something that the communication, the confrontation, or the conversation with other Christians and with other churches can teach us.